Hey everyone, this is Kevin from the chesswebsite.com, and today we're continuing our coverage of the 2018 World Chess Championship between Magnus Carlsen, the champion, and Fabiano Caruana, the challenger. The first 5 games have all been draws, some more exciting than others. Magnus Carlsen, not new to this. The last championship he had against Sergei Karyakin, they drew the first 7 games, so this is not uncommon at all. But with that brings us to game number 6. Magnus Carlsen playing the white pieces. He's changed things up every time. Last time out, he played the English opening, has also played pawn to d4. Today, he starts out with pawn to e5. Now, in the past, he's really tried to avoid this line because he knows how much Fabiano enjoys the Petrov. So, as soon as we saw this, we were curious to see if Magnus Carlsen was going to go down that path or if he was going to try something else. After pawn to e5, as expected, we did see knight to f3, and immediately we saw Fabiano play knight to f6. Now, there's an entire video on the Petrov defense. If you haven't watched that video, feel free to go watch that if you want to be familiar with how this plays out. But definitely something that Fabiano, it's one of his favorite openings. He's very familiar with it. So interesting to see Magnus Carlsen getting in his preparation to say, yes, I know this is one of my opponent's favorite moves. I'm still going to play it as white. Magnus decides to go with the classical line. Knight takes here on e5, and then pawn to d6. For those who haven't seen the video or just not too familiar with the Petrov defense, this is typically going to be the play here, pawn to d6, forcing the knight to come back and retreat. More than likely you see that because knight taking here on e4 just is not as good. Queen here to e2, attacking the knight. And then, where does black go from here? Knight to f6 is the worst move because knight to c6, this is a discovered attack and the queen is going to fall. So, definitely not going to do that. But from here, if you tried something like pawn to d6, okay, well, the queen's going to come up here. Maybe pawn takes, but then the queen just takes. If you just continue to mirror the moves, queen to e7, well, queen takes here. Queen can't take back, so maybe pawn to d6 here, but then pawn d4. If the pawn takes, white's going to recapture. White's going to be up in materials. That's why pretty much always it makes sense to play pawn to d6, forcing the knight to come back, and then the pawn is going to be free for black to take. But 99% of the time, white's going to just come back to f3. Magnus Carlsen has other plans, and he plays the pretty unique move of knight to d3. Not going to keep it there. As you can see, it is blocking off the development of the pawn here on d2. Also blocking off the light square bishop to get involved, but just getting set up to go to a place where he wants to. So after knight takes on e4, then we see queen to e2, pinning down that knight, and then queen to e7. Don't want to try to hold on to this by playing something like pawn to f5, saying, oh yeah, you can't take my knight right here. I'll defend it with my pawn, because pawn to f3 completely blows that out of the water. So from here, as you can imagine, these players playing the correct moves. Queen to e7, knight over here to f4, knight to c6, just a simple development move from black, and then knight to d5. So an interesting way Magnus Carlsen is approaching this to attack this queen here on e7. Black can move the queen, or he can move his own knight to attack the queen, and that's exactly what we see. Knight down here to a d4, and then both the queens come off the board. Very interesting to see in this position. They just say, hey, let's bring both of our queens here to e2 and e7 and then exchange those. And then the knights immediately retreat here. Knight back here to d5 and then knight to d4. That's definitely going to be better. Yes, this bishop may look tempting to go ahead and take, but if this knight takes on c1, first you have to keep in mind that the knight can come up here to c7. So that's the first thing. Check that is going to fork the rook over here on a8. But things get even worse. So king to d8, the knight takes here. Maybe the bishop moves to get the king over here to take that knight. But pawn to f3, forcing this knight to move. Knight comes back, let's say f6. And then knight up here to c3. And now the rook is attacking this knight here on c1. So things not going to go well at all. So in the game, we see Fabiano bring his knight back here to d4. Now knight to a3, this knight on d4 is attacking the pawn on c2. So both sides are attacking a fork with their opponent's king to capture a rook. So let's kind of look at the positions, because this is what both Fabiano and Magnus Carlsen are looking at. Magnus Carlsen has the option right away to go ahead and take with his own knight. This is check. He can freely take this rook here. If he does take, things don't look as great. He still has a very active knight here on e4, and that's what Magnus Carlsen is looking at. This is going to be the same check fork. King comes to e2. Do not want to bring it over here to d1 because you're just going to lose to knight to f2. So instead, have to bring your king to e2, blocking off your light square bishop. That's not good. Knight to a1. Maybe now pawn to d3. This is forcing the knight back. Knight to c5. Pawn up here, b4. Knight over here to a4. But you can see here from White's perspective, just doesn't have a great foundation as far as moving forward. His king's not really where he wants to be. It is blocking the bishop right here. His pawns don't have a very good structure, and he has the knight over here on a8. Now compare that to what happens in the real game. He says, okay, I know I have this attack, but I'm also cognizant of the fact that my opponent can take here on c2. So I'm going to go ahead and play knight to a3. I still have my strong attack, but I do want to stop this attack here on c2. Knight comes back to e6, pawn f3, forcing the knight to come back. Now pawn up here to d4, controlling the center of the board. And the knight comes back to d7, and then pawn to d3. So you can see in this position how much better it is from White's perspective to go along this path. And if you are looking at this, curious after pawn to d4 why the knight didn't come down here, just keep in mind that Black has to be aware of the knight coming up here to c7 and forking that king. So he does need to keep his knight here on e6, which is why Magnus can freely bring his pawn up here to d4. So after knight d7, pawn c3, solidifying the pawn chain, much better position for Magnus Carlsen. Pawn to c6, forcing the knight's move. Knight comes back here to f4. Knight here, b6, bishop to d3. Just opening up the board. If White wants to castle on the king side, not as important to castle once the queen comes off the board, but you never know. You may want to get your rook involved very, very quickly. Pawn to d5, just counterattacking in the center of the board. Knight to c3. Once the knight came over here to a3 to support the c2 file, right now it's not doing much of anything. It can't come here to b5 or c4, so it needs to get involved. It's not doing anything on the a file, so it comes back here to c2 so it can start to be more active. Bishop to d6, same thing. Wants to get it centralized, also opens up the door to castle on the king side if Fabiano wants to. White decides to go ahead and take here, bishop recaptures, and then king to f2. So not going to castle, wants to get as centralized as possible. Pawn h5, so yeah, I don't want you to push any further on the king side. Pawn here to h4, and then knight up here to c8. So Fabiano looks at it, he wants to get his knight involved. It's kind of blocked off on the queen side of the board. As far as how he can continue, I mean, he does have the option of c4, does look like an outpost, but from here, we're just going to see pawn to b3. Where does Black really go from here? He can't come down to any of these squares. It's going to fall. If he just comes back here to b6, well, that was really a wasted move. You just have a better position from White, and now it's White's move. If he comes back to a5, well, now it's just really hanging out. It's not doing too much at all. It's not involved. Now it can't come here to c6 or b7. So in the game, definitely could have played knight to d7. I think this makes sense as well, but the way you wanted to position it, he decided to go ahead and play c8 so he could bring it to e7 and then bring it to some other critical squares in his game plan. Knight to e3, Magnus looking to get his knight involved as well. Knight to e7, pawn up here to g3, just starting to push a little bit on the king side. Pawn c5, bishop back here to c2, and then castle on the king side for Black. If you look at this board state, it's tough to figure out exactly how Magnus continues, really both sides for that matter. But, you know, we could see Magnus Carlsen play pawn to b3. You know, he didn't play this earlier because Fabiano didn't bring his knight down here, but he could just play it. It's a great square. He could play bishop to b3 if he wants to, kind of control this light diagonal. He both has his knight and his bishop eyeing this down. Could also play pawn to a3 if he wants to worry about the dark squares a little bit more. Could also just play bishop here to d2 if he wants to. He opted for rook to d1. I think a lot of these are just personal preference. And then as you look down, the path and figure out where you think your opponent's going to go, Magnus thought that it's more important to control the center with his rook. Rook over here to d8, also controlling the center. Knight to g2, pawn takes, pawn recaptures. There is now an isolated pawn in the middle for both sides. This does open up the door for some of the rooks to control open files. That's exactly what Fabiano does immediately. He plays rook here to c8. Bishop to b3, attacking this isolated pawn in the center. Knight to c6, attacking the exact same thing from White's point of view. Bishop to f4, and then knight over here to a5, attacking the bishop. Rook to c1 says, yeah, if you want to exchange, I'll go ahead and do that. Bishop over here to b4. Bishop down to d1, and then knight to c4. You can start to feel like Fabiano has a good, strong attack in him. His board state definitely looks more aggressive than Magnus Carlsen. Magnus doesn't feel super confident. He's retreating all of his pieces, making sure he doesn't make mistakes, but definitely doesn't feel like he is the aggressor in the game. Now pawn to b3, and then knight to a3. This is setting up for the bishop to come to c3. Really, this rook would not have a good option there. He's going to fall if it's on a1 or b1. So from here, really the only good option for white. Come up here, take on c8. After the rook takes, then the rook swings over here to c1. Still is protected by the bishop, fortunately for Magnus here on f4, but this is the one way to go ahead and save his rook. So since that attack doesn't work out, knight comes back here to b5, attacking this pawn here on d4. Not a defender currently on this pawn, so Magnus decides to go ahead and take right here, and after the bishop takes, now he can come to e3. Now the knight on e3 is attacking the pawn on d5. It's no longer being defended by the bishop on e6. I think it makes the most sense from here just to come back to e6. You're defending the square. You still have your knight attacking the pawn here on d4. I don't think it's very easy for white to defend that correctly, but in the game we did see Fabiano come down here, play knight to c3, bishop to c2, bishop down here to a3, bishop over here to b8, attacking the pawn. Pretty easy for Fabiano just to play pawn to a6. Pawn f4 on the king side, bishop to d7. Pawn starts to push a little bit more since it is defended by the knight here on e3. Bishop c6, bishop down here to d1, attacking the pawn on h5. This is another spot where I really thought we would just see the knight take here on d1. This does leave black with the bishop pair. And going into the endgame with pawns on both sides of the board, I feel like this would be good for Fabiano. But from here, Fabiano might play king to f8, a bishop to a7, king e7, knight e3. I guess he just looked at this position, didn't feel like his bishops were going to do all that much, so he actually let it go, did not worry about the bishop coming up and taking here on h5. Instead, he decided to play bishop to b2, and after the bishop takes, then knight to e4. This is a great outpost, also checking the king. After the king moves, then he's free to take this bishop here on d4. So he does have a pass pawn, first pass pawn. He does want to push this. Going to be somewhat difficult with three minor pieces eyeing down on that pawn, but that is plan numero uno for Fabiano Caruana. Bishop comes down to f4. Bishop up here, c5. Bishop f3 attacking the knight. Knight comes down here to d2. And then we start to see a lot of exchanges from Magnus Carlsen. You can look at the material. It is equal on both sides. But the Magnus Carlsen decides to do a pretty interesting exchange here. Takes the pawn here on d5. Bishop comes down here, takes the knight. Bishop's going to capture material here on c6. Bishop takes on f4. Starts to gobble up these pawns over here. And then you can see right away that Magnus Carlsen, he gave up his knight in exchange for 3 pawns. Now, getting into the endgame, this does favor Fabiano. Yes, he only has 2 pawns, but his minor pieces and his king should be able to overpower his opponent and gobble up some of those pawns to get a both material advantage as well as nice positional advantage as well. Knight here to e4, pawn up here to g4, bishop down to a3, bishop to c4, king to f8, just getting involved into the game, pawn pushing to g5, knight over here to c3, and you can see there's no way to stop. Once the bishop came down here, stopping this pawn on the a file from pushing, now knight to c3, it is going to gobble up material. Pawn to b4 says, yeah, I'm opening up the door for my light square bishop to defend this. I'm also just giving up this pawn. So it came down to which pawn he wanted to lose. He chose to lose his pawn on the b file. So it takes that pawn. Fabiano goes up a pawn in material. King here to f3, knight to a4. Then the knight maneuvers around. Pawn to a4. This is an outpost, not the best outpost, not going to be doing too much for Magnus Carlsen. And then pawn up here to f6. Want to make sure he gets his pawns on dark squares, especially if your opponent only has one bishop. You want to see what square that's on. It's on a light square, so this light square bishop's not going to be doing any damage to these pawns that Fabiano has. So very smart from him. Very good in the end game, making sure that he does have those on dark squares. King to g4, knight over here to e4. And then we start to see some maneuvering from black. Bishop down here to e1, bishop e3 or d3, attacking the knight. Knight to d6, getting a safer square, also attacking the pawn here on f5. So the bishop is now tied down to this pawn, can get his king back here if he wants to, but now this bishop's starting to have to do double duty. And then he plays pawn to a5. I thought this was a mistake for Magnus Carlsen. He did not have to play this. It's just giving up a free pawn to Fabiano, and you can start to see the lead increase from Fabiano here. He does have minor piece in exchange for now just one pawn in the game. Pawn takes on f6, pawn recaptures, and this pawn's extremely important for Fabiano. Yes, you can technically win a game with a bishop and a knight, but it's not going to be easy to just get to an endgame with those minor pieces versus your opponent's king. So this pawn, if he can keep it around, that is his winning strategy. King here to g6, bishop up here to d8, wants to protect that pawn. King to h7, knight up here to f7. Magnus Carlsen knows he's in just defend mode. He can't really win from here, although, he could essentially promote his pawns. He does have a pass pawn here on the h file, but knowing that his opponent's up a lot in material, he's really just trying to draw. Bishop down to c4, knight to e5, outpost attacking the bishop, bishop to d5, both sides just maneuvering pieces back and forth, trying to see if there's something that they can find in the game. What's interesting is that after move 64, bishop here to c4, there's always computers going on analyzing all these moves. If you're watching it live on a lot of the different sites, they show you lots of different options from the computers. That's both to help the people watching it, that they're not familiar who is actually winning. They can tell you lots of different lines as far as how both sides can play. You can even play your own moves and see what that would do to a computer rating. But there's also supercomputers on different sites that are analyzing this as well. One of the supercomputers looked at this and said that there is a forced mate in 30 moves for Fabiano. Now, most of the other computers were looking at this saying that there's a lot of different options that black would have here. He could play knight to f3. He could play knight to c6 if he wanted to. He could even play bishop here to h4. Those are all fine options. None of those end in a mate. But the supercomputer, well beyond human intelligence, found a mate in 30. No way to stop it. A lot of different ways that actually ended up in a quicker mate. But that was if Magnus Carlsen defended correctly. Fabiano did not find the line in this position. The optimal move, they said, was bishop here to h4. He played knight to f3, which looks completely fine. But king to h7, knight here to e5, bishop down to b3. And you can see Fabiano just moving around, trying to find something, thinking about the long game, if there's something he can do to come up with a victory. Moves around a lot, not able to find anything. And then in this position right here on move 79, he played knight to e3. And this really just gives up his advantage that he had. The knight here on g4 was so important because the pawn can't come to h6. He can come up here, take it. It's being defended by the bishop here. As soon as he comes down to e3, then pawn to h6, black has to take it right here. He can't let the pawn come up here to h7 because then black would actually lose the game. So he plays pawn to h6. Bishop takes on h6. This is going to fall. And at the end of this, he realizes that his advantage has gone. He was not able to find a mate, and so they draw just one move after he played that knight to e3. Still going to be extremely difficult, even if he didn't play this to find the mate, because he did miss the mate in 30, which who's actually going to find mate in 30? So after 6 games, we still have a draw throughout. I'd say this was one of the more interesting ones. I think this endgame will be analyzed for many years to come. I did like the fact that both players continued to play. This was not a let's play for 33 moves, just get past that minimum threshold of 30 moves, and then we'll just do a quick draw like we've seen the past few games. So they actually did try it out. I like that Magnus Carlsen tried playing Fabiano's strength in the early game. Fabiano showing what he does in that specific defense. He knows just so many good variations and how to actually maneuver his pieces. He ended up in a better middle game going into the end game, just was not able to capitalize. So we will have a break tomorrow, and then we will come back for game number 7. Remember, Magnus Carlsen will have the white pieces, so having white 2 times in a row, and then he'll switch. Magnus Carlsen will end up with the black pieces in the final game, game 12, if it goes to that. But thank you guys so much for watching. Hopefully you are enjoying the analysis and the World Championship. No, we haven't had it in a couple years, so although I myself as a commentator as well as a fan would like to see a lot of wins, I still am enjoying this high level of chess. Hopefully you are as well. I'll see you in game 7 in a couple days. Thanks again for watching. Bye.